The book turns on an idea which is very deep in Jewish folklore, in Jewish mysticism. It's told and retold as a legend. And it was told to me when I was a child by my own mother, who grew up in traditionally very Orthodox Jewish home and was told this legend herself as a child. And it lodged in my mind, and I think for years I thought that one day it would have the makings of a great story. Then about 15 years ago, in the early 1990s, I was working as a reporter in New York City and went to Crown Heights in Brooklyn, where a lot of the action of this novel happens. And I was there among the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic sect movement that lives there, and saw this very different and very alien culture living right there in the middle of modern-day Manhattan, a world that, in a way, seemed to have been transplanted out of 16th century Poland or something. And immediately I thought something in this world would make a great context or setting for particularly a thriller, because it is so shocking and surprising, this sort of ancient civilization there in the heartbeat of a modern city. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, finally, the penny dropped and I connected the two. I suddenly thought that this idea I'd had walking around in my head since childhood, plus that setting, would go together very, very well. And the idea sort of evolved and gestated over those 5 years. And then really about 3 years ago, I finally actually got the idea that is the story of the righteous men. A lot of people have asked me, given that I'm a journalist, why I've made this move into fiction and whether it's difficult. And in a way, it's surprising to me how similar the disciplines are. For one thing, I always, as a journalist, try and make sure that I research thoroughly and that whatever people like or don't like about the opinions I offer as a columnist in particular, that at least it's accurate and truthful. And I wanted to do the same here. So everything that's researched and grounded in fact, whether about mysticism, religious fundamentalism, the geography of New York City, I have checked and triple-checked just as I would if it was a journalistic assignment. And so I went researching this book. I did go to Crown Heights in Brooklyn, in New York, as a reporter, really, with my notebook, and I followed the steps of the lead character of this novel, Will Monroe, to make sure that everything did add up the way I wanted it to and the timings fitted. That was very similar. And, of course, my hero in the story, Will Monroe, is, like me, a journalist. And not just that, but like me, a British journalist who, there in his 20s, I'm not now in my 20s, but when I was a young reporter making my way in the United States. So he and I have that in common. And I just found that journalism, I thought, was almost the ideal context for a thriller. And there's a reason why other thriller writers have used journalists as their protagonists before me. And that's because you are paid to be nosy and curious, and also you do often wander off the beaten path in a way that I imagine more formal detectives, for example, are not really encouraged or allowed to, because their job is simply that case. Journalists are often allowed to go on a fishing expedition and just see what they find. And so that's always helpful. And plus, Will Monroe has, I'm afraid, picked up several of my bad habits, and several of the little techniques he uses in the book, including those that are slightly, probably not ones taught at journalism school, are, I'm afraid, bad habits he's picked up from me. One of the curious things about this whole experience is that the book, The Righteous Men, is not actually under my own name. It is instead under the name Sam Bourne, rather than my name, Jonathan Freedland. And there's a very simple explanation for that, which is that I work as a columnist for a fairly upmarket British newspaper, and the publishers and I came to the conclusion that really it was best to keep my day job separate from this, because this is so completely different from anything I've done before, that it was a way of signaling that this is a new departure and that this is something very, very new. As for the actual name, that was in a way quite easy to decide. I wrote a non-fiction book under my own real name a couple of years back called Jacob's Gift, about the impact of becoming a father, and my first son is called Jacob, and so that was what that book was named. And a lot of people said at the time, well, your next child, Sam, is going to feel terribly jealous growing up that he doesn't have his name on the cover of a book. So Sam, it would have to be. And as for Bourne, well, people ask me, when did I start work on this book, The Righteous Men? The answer is 2004. And when was little Sam born? It was also in 2004. So that's the origin of the name, and I quite like it. I quite like having these two separate identities, and Sam Bourne can get up to all kinds of antics as a writer that I, as a fairly strict journalist, probably wouldn't dare to. Inevitably, people have mentioned this book and a whole lot of others along with the Da Vinci Code, and that's fine by me. But it is noticeable that a whole lot of these books, and several of them were around before the Da Vinci Code. My own one, The Righteous Men, I'd conceived before the Da Vinci Code. All of them turn on themes of religion or fundamentalism or mysticism. And as a journalist, putting on my other hat, as Jonathan Friedland, if you like, I can't help but wonder what that might be about, and if there's some kind of trend that has made these novels and thrillers that center so centrally on faith suddenly so popular. And I have a guess at why that might be. If you think about what thrillers are, thrillers require the stakes to be very, very high. The fate of nations and life and death needs often to hang in the balance, and that means you've got to believe that the issue that the thriller is really about really would matter that much. And in the 20, 30, 40 years ago, almost all thrillers somehow or other related to the Cold War, because that's what everyone felt was the clash of their times that could determine the fate of the world, the clash between political ideologies, between communism, the Soviet Union on the one hand, and capitalism, the West, the United States, on the other. And so hundreds of thrillers related to that. These days, what do people think is actually the clash that could lead ultimately to the end of the world? Well, it isn't a clash of political ideologies. It is, in that phrase, a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of religious beliefs. People fear that Islamist fundamentalism versus Christendom could be the huge conflict of our time. And so just as thrillers of the 60s and 70s that Frederick Forsyth's and Robert Ludlum's and Tom Clancy's dealt in the Cold War, so I think thrillers of our time now are very focused on faith and religion, because we have seen so clearly that religion and faith can drive people to extreme action. And thrillers rely on that in order for them to work. So this idea came to me completely independently several years ago, but I now take a step back and look, if you like, objectively at it and think that I am obviously part of a wider trend, and it's in non-fiction as well, of really wanting to get to grips with questions of faith and religion, because these seem to be the big questions of our time.